In the late summer of 83 CE, on the long lower slope of a hill in the far north of Scotland, roughly 30,000 Caledonian warriors looked down at a Roman army barely half their size, and by every measure available to them, they were about to win. They held the high ground. Their chariots were working the flat ground between the two armies. The Romans below them stood at the end of a supply line stretching hundreds of miles through hostile country, further north than any Roman army had ever fought. And yet, according to the historian Tacitus, whose own father-in-law commanded that Roman army, by nightfall around 10,000 Caledonians were dead against 360 men lost on the Roman side. Those figures come from one ancient author writing about his wife's father, so treat them with caution. But the detail that should stop you is not the casualty count. It is the weapon Tacitus credits with breaking the Caledonian line. Not the javelin, not the famous short sword. In his account, the decisive act was Roman soldiers punching men off their feet with a dome of metal fixed to the center of the shield. The boss. That heavy metal bump you have seen on every Roman shield in every museum, every film, every illustration, in which almost nobody ever explains. Ask what it was for, and you will usually get a single word: reinforcement. That answer is not exactly wrong. It is just spectacularly incomplete, and it hides one of the most deliberate pieces of close combat engineering in the ancient world. Over the next 25 minutes, I'm going to take that dome apart, using two surviving shields, one battle account, one Greek historian who measured the thing in the 2nd century BCE, and one bronze boss pulled out of an English river in 1867 with a soldier's name punched into its rim. And there is one detail about this dome that a surprising number of modern reconstructions still get wrong, a detail that changes how you read almost every Roman battle description ever written. I will come back to it near the end. Here is exactly what this episode covers. First, the engineering problem sitting at the precise geometric center of every Roman shield, a problem the Greeks solved one way and the Romans solved another, and why the Roman solution made the boss unavoidable. Second, the three-word Latin phrase Tacitus uses at that battle in Scotland, Mons Graupius, which proves the shield punch was trained doctrine and not battlefield improvisation. Third, the boss dredged from the River Tyne in 1867, and the name of the ordinary legionary stamped into it, a man history would otherwise have never recorded. Fourth, what Polybius says the boss was made of around 160 BCE, and why the army drifted toward bronze in the centuries that followed. And fifth, why the boss outlived the great rectangular scutum itself by more than 700 years, surviving on shields from late Roman infantry to 16th century duelists. Everything here rests on three kinds of evidence: written sources, chiefly Polybius, Tacitus, and the late Roman military writer Vegetius; two surviving shield boards, one from Egypt and one from Syria; and the excavated bosses themselves, read alongside the modern reconstruction work of scholars like Peter Connolly, who did not just draw these shields, but built them to the ancient specifications and tested what they could do. Where a number comes from a single ancient author, I will say so. Start with the battle, because the battle is where the boss stops being a museum object and becomes a tool in a fist. Our source is a short biography Tacitus published around 98 CE, about 15 years after the event, honoring his father-in-law, which makes it both the earliest detailed account of a pitched battle on British soil and a text with an obvious interest in flattering its subject. The Roman commander in Scotland that summer was Gnaeus Julius Agricola, governor of Britain, 7 campaigning seasons into a slow push north. He had subdued North Wales and the island of Anglesey, driven roads and forts up through the Pennines, established a line of garrisons across the Fourth Clyde Isthmus, and sent his fleet probing ahead along the coast to burn out coastal settlements and unsettle the tribes before his infantry ever arrived. A coordinated land and sea campaign that finally forced the northern peoples to stop trading space for time and mass for a single battle. Facing him was a confederation of northern tribes under a leader Tacitus names as Calgacus, gathered at a hill Tacitus calls Mons Graupius, its exact location still argued over by archaeologists today, with candidates scattered from Perthshire to Aberdeenshire. Tacitus puts a speech in Calgacus's mouth before the fighting, and it contains the most famous sentence ever attributed to an enemy of Rome, that the Romans make a desert and call it peace. The speech is certainly Tacitus's own composition, but it tells you the stakes as Rome understood them. Agricola made a choice before the first javelin flew that tells you how confident he was in his equipment. He put his auxiliary infantry, around 8,000 men, in the center, with roughly 3,000 cavalry on the wings, and held his citizen legions, perhaps 4,000 more men, back in reserve in front of the camp rampart. Tacitus says openly why, that a victory won without shedding Roman blood would be a great thing, which tells you exactly where auxiliaries stood in the empire's arithmetic. The men who would do the killing were not even Romans by birth. They were Batavians and Tungrians, recruited along the lower Rhine. The Batavians are worth a moment because they were not generic hired muscle. Tacitus describes them elsewhere as a people exempted from taxation and tribute, set apart, in his phrase, like weapons and armor, reserved for war. These were hereditary professional soldiers, famous across the empire for a party trick that was really a tactical capability, crossing rivers in full equipment, swimming beside their horses, a skill the historian Cassius Dio says helped decide the invasion of Britain itself back in 43 CE. And crucially, they were equipped and drilled entirely in the Roman manner, which is the whole point of what happened next. The fight opened at range, and at range the Caledonians did well. They caught Roman javelins on their small shields, batted them aside with their long swords, and gave as good as they got. So Agricola ordered 4 cohorts of Batavians and 2 of Tungrians, perhaps 3,000 men in all, to close the distance and bring it to hand strokes. This is where the 2 weapon systems met, and where one of them stopped working. The Caledonian sword was a long, slashing blade, and per Tacitus, it lacked a thrusting point. Think about what a weapon like that physically requires. A cut from a blade the better part of a meter long generates its force through arc, the edge accelerating through perhaps 180 degrees of swing, which means the man holding it needs an envelope of empty space around his shoulders roughly 2 meters wide. The Roman short sword needed almost nothing. Tacitus, writing centuries later but preserving the old doctrine, spells out the math with chilling economy, that a slash rarely kills even when delivered with full force, because bone and armor protect the vitals. But a thrust driven in just 2 inches is fatal. 2 inches of penetration against 2 meters of required swinging room. The Batavians took the room away. They stepped into the press, chest to shield, and Tacitus describes what they did in 3 verbs. Miscere ictus, ferire umbonibus, ora fodere. Rain down blows, strike with the shield bosses, stab at faces. Ferire umbonibus. Strike with the bosses. Not shelter behind them, strike with them. A man hit in the chest by 7 or 8 kilograms of curved plywood driven through a bronze dome does not keep his balance. And a man off balance in a crowd, holding a sword he no longer has room to swing, is a man about to take a short blade through the throat. The Batavian cohorts punched and stabbed their way up the slope. The Caledonian chariots tangled in the broken ground and their own retreating infantry. A flanking attempt by the warriors still uncommitted on the summit was caught and broken by Agricola's reserve cavalry, and the battle collapsed into a pursuit through the woods that lasted until dark. The 4,000 legionaries in reserve never struck a blow. The only Roman officer Tacitus names among the dead is a young cavalry prefect, Aulus Atticus, carried into the enemy line by an overeager horse. Whatever discount you apply to Tacitus's numbers, the shape of the event is clear, and the shape is what matters here. 6 cohorts did the same thing at the same time in the same way. Hundreds of men, striking with the boss in unison as a technique. Nobody improvises in unison. This was practiced, and to understand why it was practiced, you have to look at how a Roman shield was actually held, because that is where the boss comes from in the first place. Our best written description of the Republican scutum comes from Polybius, a Greek cavalry officer, once the second-ranking commander of the Achaean League, who was deported to Rome in 167 BCE as one of 1,000 political hostages taken after the Battle of Pydna. He spent 17 years in the capital, became the close friend and mentor of the young aristocrat Scipio Aemilianus, and stood beside him watching Carthage burn in 146. He studied the Roman army the way an engineer studies a rival's machine, because explaining that machine to his fellow Greeks was the entire purpose of his history. In his 6th book, he measures the shield, 2.5 feet across, 4 feet tall, curved like a section of a cylinder, a palm's breadth thick at the rim. It was built, he says, from 2 layers of wooden planks glued together with oxhide glue, faced with canvas and then calfskin, with iron edging along the top and bottom rims to take sword blows and protect the board when grounded, and an iron boss at the center. Modern reconstructions based on the surviving examples put the finished weight somewhere between 6 and 10 kilograms, and when Peter Connolly built one to the ancient specifications, his came out at the top of that range, roughly the weight of a modern car tire, carried on one arm all day. Now here is the part almost every casual description skips, and it is the part that explains everything. The grip. A Greek hoplite's shield, the aspis, was strapped to the arm. The hoplite pushed his forearm through a bronze sleeve at the center, the porpax, and gripped a cord or handle at the rim, the antilabe, so the shield was locked to his body along the whole forearm, its weight resting on the shoulder, its left half usefully overlapping the man beside him in the phalanx. Stable, but fixed. That shield could brace, and it could shove with the mass of a whole formation behind it, but it could not really move independently of the arm it was bolted to. The Roman scutum used a completely different system. A single hand grip mounted horizontally at the exact center of the board. And to make room for the knuckles, the Romans cut a hole straight through the wood. Sit with that for a second. The strongest defensive object on the ancient battlefield had a hole cut through its precise center, and filling that hole, projecting out toward the enemy, was the soldier's bare fist. That is the first and most literal answer to the question in this episode's title. The boss exists because there is a hole in the middle of the shield with a hand in it. The metal dome is armor for the fist. Every spear point, every sword edge, every axe blow that lands at the center of the shield lands where the hand is, and the dome takes it. But notice what the Romans bought with that arrangement, because they did not choose a center grip by accident. A shield strapped to the forearm can only move where the arm moves. A shield held at a single central point balances around the fist like a held tool, and because the hand sits at the board's center of mass, rotating it takes minimal effort, the way a tray balanced at its middle turns with a flick of the wrist, while a tray held at one edge fights you. It can rotate to meet a blow, extend a foot or more beyond the body to catch a javelin early, drop to cover a knee, punch out at an angle to deflect a spear thrust wide, and, critically, it can punch straight ahead. When a soldier steps forward and drives, the entire mass of the board, plus the mass of his arm, plus the momentum of his stepping body weight, arrives through the dome at the end of a straight arm, and all of that force concentrates on the few square centimeters of the dome's apex. A heavyweight boxer delivers his mass through a padded glove. This was more mass, delivered through curved metal, at chest or face height, by a man who had rehearsed it thousands of times. The dome shape does double work even in pure defense, because a curved surface presents a perpendicular face to an incoming point at exactly one spot and nowhere else. So any thrust that is not geometrically perfect glances off to the side, shedding its energy at an angle instead of delivering it into the hand behind. The boss, in other words, is not an accessory bolted onto a wall. The boss is what turns the wall into a weapon, and that is exactly the system 6 cohorts of Batavians were running, by drill, on a Scottish hillside in 83 CE. The written sources give us the theory. 3 archaeological finds give us the object itself, at 3 different moments in its life, in 3 different materials, and together they answer the question of what the boss was made of and why. The first is the oldest. At Qasr el-Harit, in the Fayum region of Egypt, excavators at the turn of the 20th century recovered something that should not exist, an almost complete Roman-style shield board preserved by the desert, dated to around the 1st century BCE. It stands about 128 centimeters tall and roughly 64 wide, and its construction matches Polybius almost line for line, 3 layers of birch strips laminated with the middle layer running crosswise to the outer two. Which is to say, the Romans were building plywood 2,000 years before the word existed, and for the same reason we do, because wood split easily along the grain, and cross-lamination means there is no single grain direction for a crack to follow. The board even thins from over a centimeter at the center to under a centimeter at the edges, saving weight exactly where strength mattered least, a detail that tells you these were engineered objects, not carpentry guesswork. But look at its center. The boss on the Phaeum shield is not metal at all. It is wood, a long spindle-shaped ridge running the vertical axis of the shield and swelling into a hump directly over the handgrip. The earliest boss was carved from the shield itself, with metal, iron in Polybius's day, added over the top for the shields that went to war. The second find shows the design at its peak. Between 1928 and 1937, a joint expedition of Yale University and the French Academy of Inscriptions, directed by the historian Michael Rostovtsev, excavated Dura Europus, a Roman garrison city on the Euphrates in Syria that fell to a Sasanian siege around 256 CE and was never reoccupied, which is why scholars call it the Pompeii of the desert. The siege itself has become famous in its own right, because the archaeologist Simon James of the University of Leicester re-examined the bodies of about 20 Roman soldiers found in a collapsed countermine by Tower 19 and argued they were killed by sulfur and bitumen smoke deliberately pumped into the tunnel, which would make Dura the earliest physical evidence of chemical warfare anywhere on Earth. And in the dry rubble of those same siege works, the excavators uncovered the only surviving semi-cylindrical scutum anywhere in the world, crushed flat into 13 fragments and painstakingly restored, about 106 centimeters tall, curved like a barrel stave, faced in red and painted with an eagle, winged victories, and a lion. It sits today in the Yale University Art Gallery. Its metal boss is missing, stripped or corroded away, but the board tells us what we need, because there at the center is the circular hole, and the trace of the horizontal grip, and a bare circle in the painted decoration where the metal plate once sat. The design Polybius measured in the 2nd century BCE was still in frontline service 400 years later, and the third find gives the boss a name. In 1867, workers on the River Tyne near South Shields in the north of England, within sight of the Roman supply fort of Arbea at the river's mouth, pulled a flat rectangular plate of copper alloy out of the riverbed with a raised dome at its center. A shield boss, and not a plain one. Engraved around the dome are the god Mars, a legionary eagle between 2 standards, the 4 seasons, and a bull, the emblem of the 8th Legion, Augusta, a formation with a pedigree running back to Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul and the field of Pharsalus. And punched into the rim in rough, dotted capitals is an inscription. The 8th Legion Augusta, the century of Julius Magnus, and the shield's owner, a soldier named Junius Dubitatus. That is the name I promised you at the top. A man who appears in no history, no chronicle, no monument, and who exists in the historical record for exactly one reason, because his name was on his equipment, and his equipment ended up in a river. The 8th Augusta was based at Argentorite on the Rhine, modern Strasbourg, and a detachment appears to have crossed to Britain in the Hadrianic period, likely around the 120s CE, precisely the years when the Emperor Hadrian visited the province and set thousands of soldiers to building his wall. So Junius Dubitatus may well have been shipped north as wall-building labor. How the boss got into the Tyne, dropped in transit, lost in a capsized boat, nobody knows. It sits in the British Museum today. Line the 3 finds up and you get the material history in one glance. Wood at the core of the tradition. Iron in Polybius's Republican army, copper alloy, bronze on Junius Dubitatus's imperial shield. Why the drift toward bronze? The archaeology suggests several pressures working together, and honesty requires saying that iron bosses stayed in use too. Copper alloy sheet is far easier to raise into a smooth dome because bronze can be hammered cold and periodically annealed, softened with heat, over and over, where working iron sheet demands a forge and far more skill. It takes engraved and embossed decoration beautifully. It polishes to a shine for the parade ground, and it does not rust on campaign in a wet province like Britain, where iron fittings needed constant oiling and attention. There is also a bias worth naming, which is that bronze survives 17 centuries in a riverbed rather better than iron does, so the record itself flatters bronze. The practical Roman answer was probably both: iron for plain issue, bronze where display and durability were worth the cost. So, pull all of it together, because this unremarkable-looking dome was doing 5 jobs at once, and each one answers part of the question nobody bothers to explain. Job 1. Armor for the hand. The center grip put the soldier's fist at the one point of the shield the enemy could reach most easily, and the dome is the fix, a helmet for the knuckles, covering the hole that made the whole system possible. And remember what a hand injury means in this system. A legionary with a broken shield hand is not lightly wounded. He is disarmed, because the shield drops and the sword arm has nothing covering it. The dome protects the single point of failure of the entire fighting method. Job 2. A deflection cone. A dome presents a glancing surface in every direction at once, so a thrust aimed at the shield's center, the natural aiming point for any attacker, slides off rather than punching through into the hand behind it. Job 3. A fist weapon, and this one was formalized in training. Vegetius, writing in the late 4th century CE, but compiling much older practice, describes the standard Roman drill. Recruits worked against a 6-foot wooden post, the palace, morning and afternoon, using wicker shields and wooden swords deliberately made at double the weight of service equipment, practicing thrusts, cuts, and shield strikes for hours against a target that never got tired. The double weight was not hazing. It was the same principle a modern athlete would recognize as overload training. A shield strike drilled 10,000 times at double weight becomes effortless at fighting weight, which is how 6 cohorts at Mons Graupius could do it in unison up a slope. The Roman army did not treat the shield as protection that occasionally hit someone. It trained the shield as a weapon that also protected. Job 4. A structural clamp. Cutting a hole through the geometric center of a laminated board removes material at exactly the point of maximum stress, and the boss plate is the repair built into the design. Riveted through the wood on all sides of the hole, it spreads the shock of any central impact across the laminated layers and binds them together precisely where repeated blows would otherwise start to split the glue lines, restoring the stiffness the hole took away. And Job 5. Identity. Junius Dubitatus is the proof. The boss was the one metal fitting every soldier carried into every formation, and it carried his legion, his century, and his name, engraved gods and eagles for the unit, punched letters for the man. Surviving Roman helmets show the same habit, some with 3 or 4 successive owners' names punched into the neck guard as equipment passed down through a unit over decades, which tells you these marks were quartermaster's bookkeeping and theft insurance as much as pride. Which leaves the last promise, the afterlife. In the 3rd century CE, the Roman army itself gave up the great semi-cylindrical scutum, shifting to broader, flatter, oval and round shields better suited to the looser formations and cavalry-heavy warfare of the late empire. And you can watch the transition happen at Dura itself, where that lone rectangular scutum was found alongside 24 painted oval boards, the old design already outnumbered by its replacement in its own arsenal. The famous shield died, the boss did not. It sits at the center of late Roman infantry shields, whose brightly patterned faces are catalogued unit by unit in the Notitia Dignitatum. It sits at the center of Saxon and Viking round shields, from the gilded boss of the Sutton Hoo ship Burial to the 64 shields hung along the rails of the Gokstad ship in Norway. Because those shields are held exactly the same way, one horizontal grip, fist in a hole, iron dome over the fist. And it sits at the center of the small steel bucklers that European swordsmen carried into the 1500s. The oldest surviving fencing manual in Europe, a manuscript from around 1300 known as I.33, now in the royal armories, teaches nothing else. Page after page of sword and buckler, a priest instructing a student, the little fist-held boss shield still being punched into faces more than 1,000 years after Mons Graupius. The scutum served Rome for roughly 4 centuries. The idea at its center, a metal dome that lets a shield be held like a tool and thrown like a punch, served for well over 1,000 years because the problem it solved never went away. Which brings me to the detail I flagged at the start, the one that a surprising number of modern reconstructions and popular illustrations still get wrong, and it comes in two parts. The first is the label you will often find on museum cards, some version of decorative reinforcement, language that frames the boss as passive, a bumper. You now know better. The second is subtler. Some reconstructions mount the hand grip vertically, like the strap of a modern riot shield, and that single choice quietly breaks the entire system. Both surviving boards, the Phaeum shield and the Dura scutum, preserve horizontal grips, and the biomechanics explain why the Romans were consistent about it. A punch thrown off a vertical grip loads the wrist across its weakest line, bending it sideways on impact. The injury any boxing coach spends the first week training out of a beginner. The horizontal grip puts the bar across the palm exactly the way a fist closes naturally. So the strike arrives aligned with the two long bones of the forearm, the same alignment as a straight punch, with the skeleton, not the wrist joint, taking the shock. Experimental archaeologists and reenactors who have actually thrown these strikes with full-weight reconstructions confirm it. One orientation delivers a punch, the other delivers a sprain. The horizontal grip is what makes Tacitus's phrase, Ferire umbonibus, mechanically believable rather than poetic. And once you carry that around with you, ancient battle descriptions read differently. When a Roman source says a line pushed the enemy back, that is not a figure of speech. It is thousands of trained men stepping and striking with a bronze dome in rhythm until the men in front of them stopped standing up. So the next time you find yourself in front of a Roman shield, in a museum case or a photograph, let your eye slide past the painted eagles and find the dome at the center, and picture what sits behind it. A hole, a fist, and 2,000 years of very deliberate engineering. It was armor, deflector, clamp, name tag, and weapon, all in one piece of hammered metal. And it broke a battle line on a Scottish hillside. If this changed how you look at that unexplained bump, subscribe for more of the ancient world's hidden engineering, and leave a like so this reaches the next person who thinks it was just reinforcement.